All right. Hey guys. Today I'm going to go through some more information off the Notes 4.1, the natural population dynamics info with you. So at this point, we've talked about defense mechanisms and that kind of information. So I'm going to talk more about factors that impact survival and reproduction. If you recall, just a quick reminder from previous info, there are two categories of information that sort of impact a population, a species population. So the biotic potential and the environmental resistance. Biotic potential are things that increase the population. Environmental resistance, things that decrease the population or push back against it. And these two things kind of go back and forth to keep the population at some sort of an equilibrium, right? All right, so other factors that impact survival and reproduction. So one is reproductive rate. So this is how often a organism reproduces, how quickly they can reproduce, like it's called the gestation period, like how long it takes to have offspring, and how many offspring they have per pregnancy, I guess whatever you want to call it, per reproduction cycle. Okay, so things that are low, pandas, some plants that are low, strawberries. Like strawberries don't reproduce. I think it takes like 2 to 3 years after planting for them to mature enough to reproduce. Plantains, which are kind of like a banana type thing, peaches, cactus, and then some of your big mammals, lions, elephants, whales, have low reproductive rates. They don't have a lot of babies per reproductive cycle. Their reproductive cycles are long, and they don't necessarily reproduce as often either. Okay. Things with high reproductive rates: rabbits, insects. We know that insects reproduce like crazy. Spiders, rodents, mice, and rats. I looked up some statistics on mice. It says that mice have a gestation period, a reproductive cycle period of 19 to 21 days. A female mouse gets pregnant about 5 to 10 times each year and can give birth to a litter of 3 to 14 pups. On average, the litter sizes range from 6 to 8. Okay, it says on average, you are looking at least 32 to 56 pups each year from one female mouse. Now, after that, you have to remember that the young ones are growing up and they're reproducing. So it says that 2 mice that sneak into your home could give birth to about 60 in 1 year. Of those new mice, about 21 to 30 are female mice capable of having their babies within a month after they're born, which can theoretically lead to over 5,000 mice in just 1 year. In other words, because you have to remember that the babies are growing up and then they're having babies. So like that can explode. You can see how fast they reproduce. Think about that, over 5,000 in just 1 year from just 2. Okay. All right. Plants, flowers, grass, weeds, trees, all that kind of stuff reproduces, has very high reproductive rates. So how do reproductive rates affect survival? Well, the higher the reproductive rate, so we're talking about survival of the species or of a population. Okay, the higher the reproductive rate, the better off a species is in terms of survival. The lower the reproductive rate, the worse off a species is for survival, because they're not pumping out as many offspring. Okay. All right. Ability to migrate for animals or disperse for seeds. So this is referring to the idea that and for animals, if animals can migrate, then if some kind of an environmental resistance factor comes into their area, like a competing predator or something, or maybe climate change is changing their environment. If they're able to migrate or move to other areas, if they have that ability to survive in other areas, then that increases their survival and reproductive chances. Okay, if they don't, if they can only deal with like that one kind of habitat or something, and if something comes in, then they're at a higher chance of extinction. Okay, seed dispersal for plants. The further away that a plant can disperse its seeds and spread its population, the better it is for survival and reproduction of it. Because if you think about it, if a plant drops all of its seeds right at the base of the plant, then all of those seeds are competing for the same resources, the same sunlight, the same minerals and nutrients in the soil, the same literally growing space. So things that can cause it to disperse or spread out will increase the chances of those seeds of surviving and reproducing and going on. Okay. Ability to invade new habitats. So that is how well can the organism survive different habitats. Oh, I'm sorry, so I misspoke. The migrate for animals here is migration to, that would be like birds migrating south in the winter or something like that, or stuff along those lines, I think. The ability to invade new habitats is if an organism goes into a place, can it find new food sources? Can it survive the environmental conditions, the abiotic conditions, stuff like that? Okay. We've talked about defense mechanisms, obviously. And then ability to cope with adverse conditions. So just in general, the more, I don't know a better way to say this, but basically the more bad situations that an organism can survive, obviously the better off it will be at survival and reproduction. So the wider range of temperature an animal an organism can withstand. Okay, if it's only got a really narrow range of temperature it can withstand, then it's much more likely to have trouble surviving and then reproducing. The types of the amount of water precipitation that it needs. If it can handle a much wider range from a lot to a little, then it's got a much higher chance of survival. Stuff like that. Okay. All right. So, environmental resistance factors. Combination of all the biotic and abiotic factors that can limit a population's increase. All right, so what I've done here is I've given kind of a list of different ones. You can see them. The B and the A in parentheses, I've labeled them as biotic or abiotic. Okay, some of them can be both, obviously, because there's biotic and abiotic things. So lack of food and nutrients. So for organisms that eat other living organisms, it would be a biotic factor. For things like plants and stuff that use minerals and nutrients from the soil and sunlight, that would be abiotic. Okay, but that can limit it. Lack of water, lack of a suitable habitat, adverse weather conditions, those are all abiotic. Predators would be biotic. Disease. Communicable means able to be transmitted from one organism to another. That's biotic because it matters on the other living things on how much it gets transmitted. If it's a genetic disease, that would be abiotic. I mean, it's still kind of biotic, but like it doesn't. I say abiotic because it's not impacted by other organisms. It's within the individual organism's genetic makeup. Okay, parasites can impact a population, and other competitors for resources, not necessarily predators, but like things that are competing for the same food sources, same water sources, those type of things. Okay, so those are all things that can decrease an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. All right, now, environmental resistance factors can fall into two categories: density dependent or density independent. All this means does the factor get worse or better based on how big of a population of the species there are? So does the density or the number of individuals in an area, in an individual population, does the number of individuals make it better or worse? Does it change how that factor works? If it does, that's density dependent. If it doesn't, that's density independent. So let's look at density dependent. Food availability. Okay, that's density dependent. You see this a lot of times with deer. When deer have a abundant food source, like farmers' fields or stuff like that, they can grow and reproduce rapidly into large numbers. If that food source somehow then is taken away, the farmer fences in their area, or it's harvested and the same food source isn't planted the next year, something like that, they can, then that population that was based off of that food source is no longer there, then that can lead to starvation and large numbers dying off, kind of like the J curve. Okay, you can also see images of forests that have been stripped by an overpopulation of deer from the ground up. Like anything that was green and living was eaten off. They'll even eat like the bark off of trees if they're starving because there's such a low food source. Okay, so that would be density dependent. The more deer there are, the harder it is. They're all competing for food. The worse that factor gets. The smaller the population, the better it is because there's more available food per individual. Okay. Habitat space, obviously. Contagious diseases. This one is density dependent because if it's contagious, think about COVID, right? What do they tell you to do? Wear masks, socially distance, right? Stay away from large groups and large numbers of people because that's how it's transmitted. So same thing in animal populations. The more dense the population is, the more easily the contagious disease is going to spread, and it's going to have a larger effect. So it's density dependent. The effect of it is density dependent. Reproductive choices or options, that can go both ways. The more individuals there are, the more choice they have, but at the same time, the more individuals there are, the more competition there is for mates, so that's kind of an in-between. Okay, let's look at density independent. So these are things that it doesn't matter how many individuals in the population there are, the environmental resistance factor still acts the same way or impacts them the same way. So genetic diseases, we talked about that, it's just in the genes, so it's you can't transmit it, it's not going to kill more if there's more animals, okay? Predators, this one might seem weird, but predators are, for the most part, they're just going to eat what they need to eat and survive. So predators are not necessarily dependent upon the population. Like if you get a large population of deer, that doesn't mean that the wolves are going to eat more because there are more of them there. Now, we know over time, given a larger food source, the predator numbers will increase, but we're not talking about the predator numbers, we're talking about how it impacts the prey on that situation, the organism itself. Okay, weather. So like storms or fire, stuff like that. Like it doesn't matter if there's 3 individuals or 3,000. The fire's still going to burn the same area, and it's going to kill some or not. It doesn't make the fire worse because there are more organisms. Okay. Water precipitation in terms of the amount of water that falls, not necessarily water availability, but the precipitation. Pollution. Pollution's it would be there no matter how many are in the population. Okay. Soil type and nutrients, that one's kind of in between either. Like the amount of stuff going into the soil will remain the same, but if you're talking about plant populations, obviously the more you have, the more they're going to use it, so it would be limited. So that one's sort of kind of in between independent and dependent. Atmospheric conditions. So like normal atmosphere, weather, temperature, like normal, like climates, okay? Like we have 4 seasons here. That stuff, obviously, it's going to be there no matter what. It doesn't get worse based on the number of population. So those are density independent. Okay, 2 categories. All right. Last 2 things from these notes section are just the definitions of carrying capacity and critical number. These are also related to the population. Carrying capacity. Capacity means like the limit to the amount of something. the maximum population of a species that a given habitat can support without the habitat being degraded, that means harmed, over the long term. In other words, a sustainable system. So carrying capacity is essentially the biggest population for an organism that can be supported by a habitat without the habitat being destroyed. So I was telling you guys about the deer stripping everything from in a forest if they're overpopulated from the ground up. That's over the carrying capacity, because that overpopulation of deer is harming that environment in the long term and the short term, both. Okay? Critical number. Critical number is sort of the opposite end. It's a minimum population number upon which the survival and recovery of a population is dependent. If the number of an organism falls below this, the population, they will basically go extinct. There's northern white rhinos are a good example of this. I think there's last I looked, I think there's one left in the entire world. But a few years ago there was 4 or 5 of them, or maybe 3, I don't remember. But that number is just too low for that species to reproduce enough to come back. It's too low. So even though there are still living organisms of that species, it's sort of like dead man walking type of thing. It's like the species isn't going to survive. They're going to die off. So the critical number is the minimum population that a species needs to survive and reproduce. And if it falls below that, the species is not going to be able to survive, and it will go extinct. Okay. All right, that's it for those. Good luck on the work, and if you have any questions, please text me or message me through Google Classroom or something like that. See you guys later.